I think everyone can hear those questions, so I won't repeat them. Ma'am, perhaps I can ask you to answer this one first, comment on this one.
I think that it's a perfectly fair concern. I think most of us would believe that there are far too many unnecessary animals, particularly offered for sale. Some of those will have been bred by people who have mares and think that that's what they're there for, to breed from, irrespective of their talent. And others will be more like the cases that we've seen, where total lack of care and attention to a group of animals results in indiscriminate breeding of almost everything and anything. The control issue is a much more difficult one. Even for those responsible owners, it seems it's a pretty difficult decision to make, whether you breed from mares or not. I know from experience that people who've had mares that are difficult to break and almost impossible to ride have then been turned away as breeders, because that's all you can do with them. Well, that seems to me almost a worse offence than having ignorant people who don't understand about indiscriminate breeding, is to actually breed from a mare that is fundamentally, temperamentally unsound for whatever reason. Temperament has to be your main consideration in mares anyway. Performance, yes, that would be really nice, to concentrate a bit more on the performance of your mares, but temperament must be crucial. And decisions about what to do with mares for a responsible owner must be taken more seriously. I don't think there's a control you can apply to that in terms of ownership, but it does imply that you should have a responsible attitude to ownership and what you do with those animals in the long term. The indiscriminate ones, the cases that we've seen, that group of 25 animals, presumably some of those, I don't know what they started from, but the numbers grew from indiscriminate breeding, were just left to their own devices. Once upon a time there was a licensing scheme for stallions, but that never worked because nobody ever paid any attention to it. So it doesn't exist anymore, and I don't know how difficult it would be to replace that with any form of legislation. I think that it comes down to what we were talking about. It is about education. And if some of those cases could have been prevented by a better understanding of responsible breeding in the first place, perhaps we wouldn't have had some of those cases at all. But for responsible owners, they still have to stop and think about what they're doing. And it may be even a mare that you're particularly fond of and you think is absolutely charming and is perfect for the amount of grass that you've got, but it's actually not a very good reason to breed from it. And knowing breeding too, understanding about the importance of bloodlines and actually knowing where the mare is from and how it's bred should be a crucial part of your decision-making process, and not just because it's there. If education could change that attitude to responsible breeding, then that is something we ought to add to it. But I think it is a part of that concern. I really do think it's part of the prevention, is that concept of responsible breeding.
Well, thank you very much. Nick, perhaps I can come to you, because of course racing has its own charity, Retraining of Racehorses, which is undertaking a ever-growing support of that. And there are also, through some sponsors actually represented here, South Essex Insurance Brokers, they've been organising competitions. But rumours of market forces also having their effect, perhaps, in the racing world?
Absolutely. The final figures haven't been published from Weatherby's, but unofficial reports suggest that a 10% drop in foal production has taken place in the last 12 months, which can only be seen as encouraging in the current economic climate. If there's one good thing to come out of a recession, it's suggested that the foal population comes down a little and we're not overburdened with more horses than the industry can cope with. But one thing we need to talk about when we're talking about whether we overproduce in this country is our relationship with the rest of Europe, because quite rightly we welcome the free trade of horses between Britain, Ireland chiefly, and also France and Germany. And whilst we welcome that, we also need to harmonise, if we are going to have controls, between the nations. Ratio of British breds to race, for example, is probably something in the region of 60% of horses produced. Still leaves an awful lot of horses that need a job to do. The ratio of Irish breds to race is probably under 40%. With the free exchange between the countries, that still leaves Great Britain and Ireland with a common problem that they need to address. But obviously we welcome free movement between nations, and although an unfettered free market isn't the only way forward, I think it's going to be very difficult to impose realistic controls. As has already been said, I wouldn't want to see a limit on mares being put into foal. I wouldn't want to see anybody say, you can't breed from this mare because she's not good enough in terms of ability, partly because we're not sophisticated enough in our knowledge of genetics to think that a poorly bred mare isn't going to produce a good foal or a decent performing racehorse, and partly because I don't want to see small breeders being driven out of the game. If you say, right, only the rich and only the well-bred horses can produce, then I think you drive the grassroots, the lifeblood of the racing industry out, and I think that would be a problem. And overproduction is as much of a problem at the top end of the thoroughbred industry as it is at the bottom end of the industry. People will flood the market with hundreds of progeny of one very good stallion as they will one very bad stallion. So big studs are just as responsible as small studs for flooding the market with too much of the same gene pool, and I think that's fundamentally a problem. And I would really welcome what they've done with See the Stars, this tremendous racehorse we've all enjoyed this season. He's standing at a realistic fee in the economic climate, but his owners have suggested that his book will be limited to 75 or 80 mares. So he'll take the very best, and they won't flood the market with his progeny. And if anything, I'd like to see more stallions standing with smaller books, and therefore we don't have so many inbred horses, we widen the gene pool, yet at the same time we have enough to be able to cope with. And one final point, people often talk about too much racing in this country. You always hear it, there's too much racing, too much rubbish. If there wasn't too much racing, we'd have a much greater welfare problem. We need the bad racing to sustain the amount of moderate horses that we're producing. Think about what would happen if we got rid of all the bad racing. We'd have more welfare cases on our hands. We don't want that.
Nick, good points. Thank you. Richard, would you like a quick comment?
Just very quickly, as well as the overbreeding in quantity, for which I do beg of you, don't appeal to politicians to try and sort out. It's not a job for government. It's a job for the industry. I'm not suggesting just market forces, but it's for the leadership of the industry. It's not for politicians to decide which horses can breed and which can't. That would be a disaster. But it's also the over-quality. And I just do detect now in Parliament more people asking questions about the kind of performance we're requiring from horses, whether it's to go faster, to jump higher, to stop and turn faster, whether there are knock-on animal welfare issues that are starting to be raised. I know the Horse Racing Authority are ahead of the curve here. I went to their meeting a few months ago, and I think they're taking this issue very seriously. I think we need to look at the welfare pressures that will come from ever more competitive sporting environments, and that is an area which I think, again, it is for the industry, the various disciplines to try and self-regulate where possible. It's really not best for politicians to get involved in legislative terms.